And obviously there are a couple of polar extremes in terms of school of thought. So there's one school of thought that says this is all really difficult for carbon emissions because it's just a ton of load we could do without, and it places all kinds of constraints on supply chains that are already quite stressed. There's another school of thought that says this is an enormous opportunity to help with affordability, to drive economic growth, which will also help with the affordability of the transition. But also AI itself could be a huge unlock for some of the problems we're grappling with as we think about how we challenge some of these. So I'm going to put my cards firmly on the table. I'm in the optimist camp. Anyone who's heard me talk on this subject, seen any of my socials, will know that I and Sverre and I were just talking about this at the Norwegian Pavilion, so he also smiling because he knows that. So that's where I come on from on this. What I would like, if possible, is for this to be a conversation. So rather than having everyone sort of make opening remarks, what I'm going to ask is that, as I said, I'm just going to flip round from left all the way round, get people to introduce themselves. Then Sophie from Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero is going to make some opening remarks. And then if you can all just raise your hand, nod, catch my attention. But as I said, please, if you could try and make this conversation and discussion around that theme. If there are some Cassandras here who feel very differently from me, lovely to hear from them. If we're all in violent agreement, then let's work out how we can make this happen. But that's the way we'd like to run this session. So I will start, Tanya, if you could just introduce yourself, and then we'll go around the table.
Sorry. Tanya Kumar, I'm Director of Net Zero at the Confederation of British Industry. So we represent businesses across the entirety of the net zero space in the UK.
Hi, hello, Ricardo. I'm a Managing Director and Partner at BCG, and I serve clients in the power sector, generation, distribution, transmission. So key topic, very hot topic, data centers. Everybody wants to talk about it, and so very, very nice to have this conversation here.
Hello all, my name is Florence. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer of ENGIE, which is an international utility.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Peacock. I look after strategy, regulation, corporate affairs for SSE, and I guess we're interested in this from the network side, where we run networks, but also the renewables side, because we do a lot of clean power as well.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Tony Allard from Hitachi Energy, and I'm the Chief Marketing and Sales Officer for Hitachi Energy, which is a global leader in power grid technology.
Thank you. I'm Sverre Alvik. I'm VP and Head of Energy Research at DNV.
Sophie Miramadi, VP of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Aviva. We do industrial software across the energy, water, and power infrastructure and data centers, and generally the industrial power consumers as well.
Thanks. I'm Alan Thompson. I'm the Global Energy Business Leader for Arup. So that's management consultancy, engineering, delivery, across all renewables, transmission, distribution, storage, nuclear, and a range of other things.
Hi, I'm Sophie Westlake, Deputy Director of International Energy at Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And then I crack on. Great. So I participated in this kind of, would we almost say exact same event last year. I don't know if maybe you were, Sarah, as well. No, maybe. But that was, I thought it was one of my favorite discussions of last COP, and so I was determined to join us again this time. I have to say, you were optimistic last year, but I was feeling much more like, oh no, this could be a really big problem. And I feel like over the past year, there has actually been much more discussion, much more research, much more coming out that gives me much more optimism actually this year. And I think in particular, the IEA did a report where it looked specifically at the sort of AI for energy for AI concept. And the conclusion was broadly that actually the opportunity here, even with existing use cases, you can reduce your energy consumption to a level that outpaces what we expect to need to power these institutions or this infrastructure. So that for me was quite a critical conclusion. And then in terms of sort of how we get there then is the big question, because I think that is that is one scenario where that we enable that and we use really positively the opportunities of AI. But it feels to me like, you know, it's not a given. Like, we are going to need to think, and we're going to need to think in a policy context as well. And given that we are here at COP, we're going to need to think in a climate policy context about how we manage this process, what we do, and also how we collaborate internationally. So, I mean, I'd note in the UK we announced a 3.7 million, which is not a great deal, but the AI for Decarbonisation Innovation Programme. You know, so that's a vehicle that we're looking at this specific innovation question. But I think we're quite early on the journey of like really figuring out the policy questions about, you know, how we ensure these things are powered and we can extract the best value. I think the IEA report was really instructive in pointing to some specific use cases such as tackling grid outage. They said that you could reduce by 30 to 50% outage duration by AI fault detection. I'd also flag there was the increase in effective capacity of existing transmission lines. And I hear a lot that like the congestion on the grids is such a massive issue, and we can really reduce our need to outbuild the grid by making best use of that AI opportunity. And then this huge opportunity for AI data centers to operate flexibly themselves is like one of the key challenges that comes out of that report. So it would be great to hear sort of insights from those around the table on some of those things. Then I wanted to also note in the G7 this year, which we concluded the ministerial just a couple of weeks ago, there was the launch of this AI work plan. What do we call it? A work plan or a AI and energy project in any case. And we talked about the ways that we can collaborate as a group on the AI and energy question. And again, there was a lot of a focus around optimizing grid use, ensuring that it gets that capacity, and that was extremely important for some delegations to make sure that we are committed to providing that capacity. We wanted to boost knowledge exchange, and then we also we talked quite a lot about the workforce challenges, which I'm sure many of you are feeling in your various industries. So those were, I guess, yeah, the key questions on my mind is sort of what's useful in the kind of international context for us to collaborate on, and where are the key technical advancements that you think that we should be most aware of. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sophie. So who would like to start? Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. That was really interesting. I think the one piece that strikes me, particularly in terms of UK PLC export potential, is that work that we're doing on data sharing infrastructure for energy, currently working for NESO, National Energy System Operator, because all of this AI is really dependent on clear, low-friction data transfer around the system. And just picking up on the point in terms of outage management, the first use case within that program is outage management. So when people say to us, yeah, it's a great idea, but it probably doesn't work, it actually has been done. The first 6 months of the program was looking at outage management. It's been successful. We're now moving on to connections and onto strategic grid development. And you know, everywhere I go in the world, I see you expect people to know what left and right hand are doing, but do they? No, not at all. And certainly when you move into a dynamic situation, you know, emailing PDFs back and forwards is not what it's about. It's about really transparent, fast, machine-to-machine interaction and dynamism.
Alan, could you just give us a bit more on what success looked like on that outage management? Because that's interesting. So,
yeah. So, you know, if you look at something like North Hyde, where you have an incipient problem, and you've taken 6 months to get to the point where you have an outage, and I'm not going into the details too much of that, but there were a number of occasions where, in an ideal world, that would have been solved, but it couldn't be solved because it takes about 6 months worth of people shuffling paper in, for want of a better word, backwards and forwards. Now, if you imagine a situation where the data on the current system status, on the demand status, on the, the ambient temperature and weather systems and so forth, enabled you to say, right, we can get another 6 hours of outage here. We can do both things, we can have our cake and eat it, for instance, then that would be a really valuable exercise. The reason why outage was chosen was primarily because the data was in pretty good shape, and there were a number of key entities, 6 entities in that particular instance that got together to resolve it. In fact, the next price control review period, NESO will be obligating 26 UK energy entities, primary energy entities, to start using that system.
From an electricity perspective, there are 2 main issues. One is power, the other one is capacity. And data centers is obviously a very relevant player in both these 2 issues. And then with a lot of increasing variability or variable renewable production, we also have the time management of that. So capacity at one time of the day is very different from another. So these issues and what is the real problem or challenge varies a lot from country to country. In some countries it's the total capacity, in others, or peak capacity, in others it's the total production. If you look at US at the moment now, there's increasing power prices. It's mainly due to data centers increased, not loads, but total energy consumption. In other countries that's not an issue at all. So this varies a lot over time, and what we find, and then another very important issue on this is the data center's ability to pay, because most of these centers, they are not very price sensitive. They are able to pay more than most other consumers, and then it's very much a regulatory issue on whether they will be allowed to sort of be on top of the value chain, or whatever we call it, and out-compete the other players, or whether it's not. And data centers can be both strategically important. This could be yours and mine health data, or it could be sort of TikTok videos. So data storage is a lot of things, and probably it needs to be regulated differently and all that. So there are a number of issues here, and yes, you can be optimistic on many of these, but there are also some real concerns that the industry is facing now.
Just a brief comment. I was thinking on terms of your opening remarks, it's because I was here briefly for last year's session, and I was sitting there thinking about, has this moved on a lot in that time period? And I agree with you, Sophie, the IEA report is brilliant, and it gives us some interesting stats that we should keep measuring where we get to on them. But I think the thing that I've noticed in my business is that, in SSC, is that about a year ago, we'd have been talking about things like chatbots that we were using on the customer service sites and things like that. While now you're talking about putting more predictive stuff into our power stations, starting to think about how you can get more grid stability and some of the things that you mentioned. So if I'm sitting there looking at actually, and in transmission, we now got some sort of AI fault detector thing that starts to run along the top. Now this stuff will get better and better and better over time, but I do feel we're starting to move into a world more of action, which is why I'm in your optimist camp, because you're starting to see real use cases. And that's, in my company, that's only over a year. We've really had a big push forward in it. So I'm in your camp, I think.
Yeah, and just, well, hand the microphone around. To give another tangible example, we're moving on to the world of agentic AI, where AI is not about, questioning it, but can actually act. And we had a really interesting example where recently we sat a bunch of people down to say, and this is the way you typically solve these problems, how could we connect people faster to our network? And you'll get all the subject matter experts in a room, and they'll sit down and you'll set them a challenge of, if it takes you 6 months, get it to 3. And in parallel with putting all our experts in a room, we asked an AI agent the same problem. And the answers it came up with blew our minds and blew the people in the room's minds, and said, we probably could have sat there for 6 months and not got to that solution. So there is another level of AI coming, which is not large language models, which is agents. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of excitement. And I don't think we're alone. I think a lot of businesses are looking at that saying, this is just a really powerful tool that can knit data together and make, some quite great leaps forward. Anyway, I saw lots of hands jump up, so I don't want to dominate. So to Anthony.
I took all of the mic, so I'll go. No, just one quick topic, Sophie, to build on what you say. An additional use case we've seen over the last 12 months also has been not only about how AI can help the grid, but also how AI can help one of the biggest bottleneck, which is interconnection queue, which is a big issue around the world. So right now, as we speak, we are working with NVIDIA and a regional transmission operator in the US to cut the time by 80%, 80 through the use of AI, and that's reality, right? This is almost finalized. So that's also something to look into. It's not only about helping the grid, but it's also helping the rest of the community that needs to be participating.
I just wanted to verify, Sam, the point that you were making around rapid adoption over the last year. So we provide software for almost all the kind of power generation and grid transmission and distribution in the UK, and we've definitely seen real progress in the last year of companies getting their data in the right place to be able to really drive value from predictive analytics, process simulation, and other tools on the grid to manage that huge complexity. The other point I wanted to make is that we're seeing increasing deployment of AI tools in managing the efficiency of data centers themselves. We're a software company. We're owned by Schneider Electric Energy Management Company. So we are now routinely going to data centers and applying techniques which we use in other industrial contexts. So look at thermal modeling, look at fluid dynamics, real-time situational awareness, to use process simulation to make cooling systems as effective as possible, so to reduce the energy load of the data centers themselves.
And that's another area we've been working on. I mean, we invested in a company called Emerald AI, and we're hoping to run a trial with them on a big London data center. But you know, they've had a lot of success in the US in showing that actually AI data centers have more flexibility than you thought, and typically 20% of load is not time critical and can be shifted. And this is a really powerful technology that actually operates at the individual NVIDIA chip level. So you know, this thing can do the kind of things that system operators like, a level of fidelity that other loads can't do. So again, I think to both Sophie's point, there has been tremendous progress and innovation even in the last year since we discussed this, and things that a year ago we were saying, well, maybe, and we're now at the point where, as I said, we'll be deploying that technology in a London data center, hopefully to then prove it can scale. I'm conscious, I'm sort of leaning that way to the side of the table.
No, I think a bit of a different angle, right, that I wanted to bring is all this demand needs to be connected, right, and that's the big topic here. And hello? Oh, okay. We recently launched a study. I don't know if you guys had a chance to see. If not, I recommend. It's called Mind the Queue. And basically, it's how countries and companies can help reform grid connection processes to be able to handle the queue of new load that is happening. And of course, I mean, when we look at data centers, we saw times from 5 years to 9, 10 years in different countries, and how that can be debottlenecked. And part of it is the regulation, and there are ideas of countries that are doing things that are useful to unlock the regulation. And part of it is the supply chain, right? Working more efficiently, bringing projects faster, prioritizing demand and all this. One of the interesting ideas there is the flexible connections, right? We're used to a connection to the grid that is a connection, and that's it. Maybe in the future we're going to have different tiers and levels of connections that are flexible during the day, connections that are faster to get your access than others, and you pay for it. And to the point that these customers that can pay more will have a way to find in the regulation a way to get the connection faster and more efficiently. So those are the kind of ideas also to put at the table here.
So maybe for NG, what I can do is the perspective upstream, what we try to do to limit the impact on the grid. And what we develop now with some data centers is that we try to co-develop on the same site. So the data center, the green asset to produce the energy, and the batteries, in order for all together, for all these complex to be together, and then to be able to be more flexible, and then to limit the impact on the grid. And so we are doing that more and more, and I think that it could help then all the system.
Just picking up on the connectivity point, because from a perspective now of seeing a new sector that's coming into the queue is hugely problematic. And I think there's something that we've mentioned about regulation, that we don't know how to regulate and the industry's moving faster, essentially. So one plea in working with a lot of businesses and with government is not to repeat mistakes that we've seen before with the connections for sort of large energy users in different sectors, essentially, because you've got a new sector and governments need to think about how are those sectors defined. Is it a major energy user? Is it a digital company? And that's the bit that I am optimistic, because there's so many efficiency gains to be had, but at the same time also quite concerned because regulation and the regulators can't keep up with the pace of change, essentially. And you're in a situation where there will be some parts of the economy that are quite concerned about AI and what it means for their business, that don't have the capacity and the tools to be able to understand actually how it's going to modernize or be able to give them cost savings. So there's a big piece on the narrative here for those of us that are excited by that, to really explain that. I mean, we've recently gone out to a range of companies across the UK, and they're excited, but they're also really concerned about how do they explain the AI transition to staff, because people are worried about how this is going to take their skills, take their jobs as a result of efficiency gains for a company, essentially. So there are lots of challenges, I think, that we ourselves, those of us that are optimistic, need to step in the fold, where maybe government doesn't have that understanding and doesn't have the skill sets on the innovation. So I'd be interested in others' reflections around the room, because this is moving at pace. I really reflect on that like a year on, that everybody is adopting quite quickly, essentially. Much quicker than things like energy efficiency, for instance. In fact, we've leapfrogged for a lot of people. So people are using more AI, ChatGPT, and there's something that we can actually learn. How can AI, this story, how can we use it on other parts of the net zero transition to help us actually bridge the gap where we're not making headwinds?
So if we are to be optimistic on the future of AI and AI energy use, it does need some regulations. Load shifting is interesting not only in time but also location-wise. And what we see now, for example, in Norway, where I live, is that all municipalities want to establish a data center. But obviously some places there is very little power or capacity available, and other areas there is a lot. And if you have AIs on top of the value chain in terms of ability to pay, and that is not regulated, then they will establish themselves wherever they like. And that will give problems for the other industry or for the households or for other players. But if you have some governments pointing into that this and this and this area is suitable, these three areas are not, then you get a much better. And if you are a company to establish a data center, it shouldn't be that important whether you establish on location A or location B. You could take some governmental regulation on that, and so that is one area we need to be aware of for this. And then the other discussion on sort of the benefit of AI is a big one, of course. And at the moment we see maybe that the energy use comes before the energy savings. So there is an increase, and then over time we agree that maybe the decrease in energy use is bigger than the 5 or 8 or whatever % of energy that AI ultimately will use, but it will probably come later in time.
Yeah, but you know, just to build on that, so that comments fair. And Steve, you probably know the details better than I, but what I'm reading is last November in the UK we had 41 gigawatts of connection request. In June this year we had 125. About 100 of that is from data centers. Now this isn't just about like we would do with perhaps generation connection, where we look at the project and say, is this project sufficiently mature to come on the bars? It's about saying, is this project appropriate to come on the bars? And back to your point, is it in an appropriate location? Because the price signals are not what's driving the behaviours. It's maybe fibre optics, it may be latency, it may be other issues, but it's certainly not that. The other point I just want to touch on briefly as well is the redundancy levels that play into data centres. You know, so moving from a data centre that has pretty much no redundancy capability to one that's 2N, so it's basically mirroring. You've basically got two data centres doing one data centre's worth of work. We really need to understand the carbon footprint of that and demonstrate the carbon footprint of it. I know, you know, the hyperscalers have been talking about the carbon footprint for many, many years. They're missing their targets. Maybe they're feeling a little bit more relaxed because people aren't jumping up and down and saying, hey, come on, we want low carbon stuff. But I think the demonstration of, you know, why do you need some of this redundancy? Because you absolutely don't need it in all instances, and getting that in the right space.
Just a couple of points prompted by location and methodology. So I think there are times where we do need to think about strategic location of data centers, particularly where we have an abundance of renewable power, which is currently being curtailed, right? So Scotland, we're working on a really interesting project right now with a customer who is building a hyperscale data center, which will be delivered by Schneider Electric, that will be fully powered off wind and wave power. So it's the first time that will happen in the UK. And so the role of our software is to balance the intermittency of the power supply with the scheduling of the AI workload. And you know, in those situations where there really is too much power, then to divert into on-site green hydrogen. So I think we're looking to kind of create a new model there, which should show how you can not necessarily be constrained by where the grid is, but look at where the renewable power is, and you can look at sort of smaller scale examples of that as well in individual local authorities, for example. And to pick up on your point on methodology, for those of me that have those that have heard me on other panels, I come back to this topic a lot. We need to have a clear way of measuring the net environmental impact of AI. And it's great that the hyperscalers are beginning to measure this around power, but also water. But there's no agreement. There's lots of debate, and we need to have an industrial standard that enables us to calculate that, so that when you're thinking about applying an AI application, you know what the net impact of that is going to be, and you can make that calculation. So a plug there, there's the IEEE working group that is going to be publishing a standard in January.
And just to build on this kind of connections, pace and locations point, and Steve, you'll have an opinion on this as well, is one of the things from the DNO perspective, so we obviously run a DNO, is you have to treat all customers equally. So there's a kind of prioritization piece, which feeds into Tanya's point, which is if we believe that data centers are the most important connection thing that we need in the UK or whatever country it is, we need to find some way of allowing the DNOs to push them through. That doesn't exist right now. I know there's a kind of thought in the new one of having, I can't remember the terminology, but some sort of special cases type piece, but that isn't a thing at the moment. So right now, Steve's business and my business have to treat them totally fairly. I think the locational point's really, really interesting, and I agree with all the points made. For me, I think there's something you can do around sort of demand credits or exemptions from certain charges to try and get these to locate in the right places. I'm hopeful that in the UK, that kind of country plan, the SSEP that we should see at some point, will end up being pretty useful as a way of determining it. But there's sort of 3 or 4 building blocks you kind of need to get together. You need to get that plan, you need to get that sort of charges, exemptions, and then maybe to make sure the growth zones are kind of in the right places. So it's tricky, and there's still some work to do before our businesses can actually process it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and to build on Tanya's point and points that others have made, we just need to be really careful. I mean, we were behind the curve on getting in front of the generation queue, and we are now, you know, trying to make progress to solve that problem. There is a very real risk, and you quoted the numbers, Alan, that we're going to recreate that problem on the demand side. So we need to make sure we don't. And actually, one of the things that isn't always apparent to people is, you know, from a build perspective, they're actually identical problems. You know, you need a bay at a substation, you need commissioning engineers. So at least in the very short term, there is contention between the two, because you face choices at the margin in a constrained supply chain about who you connect. So it does need some help for us to help us sort of prioritize. And there may be some choices to be made about whether we, you know, do prioritize some of these, because they're big fee-paying customers. They help to cover the cost of the network. But those are decisions that are going to have to be made by policymakers and regulators, because there is no magic solution here where we can do everyone all at the same time. But I do agree with you, Sam, that at the moment we do have a system on the demand side, as on the generation side, where it's still first come, first serve, which doesn't make any sense. And that's probably why you're seeing this massive ballooning, because it's the same game you play. If you're a developer, just try and get one of these magic tickets, because it has value. So I think there's a narrow window to try and get out in front of that and to think about a better way of planning this. I still come back to the optimism point, and you know, the good news on the transmission system on the demand side is, you know, we have a system that was sized for roughly 60 gigawatts, and back in the day we used to hit, you know, high 50s. We only hit 40s now, so there is latent capacity on this system because of both energy efficiency and also loss of large industrial loads. But at the moment we don't really have a process that signals that to people. So, you know, we recently came out on some sites on our system, and there's no magic. Most of them are coal-fired power sites or sites where we used to have large industrial loads, and said, look, you want to put a data center here? It's relatively easy, it's relatively quick. And we've had quite a lot of interest. So there's an opportunity to sort of break the process and say, here's where we'd really like you to be. If you want to come here, it's super fast. If you want to go elsewhere, it's going to take us longer. So, but I do think we need to make sure in doing that we don't prioritize them over, you know, and not just large industrial load, there's housing load as well. So it's a complex problem, but we do need to get out in front of it.
Just to build on what you say, in the US there is a different situation where AI data center in general want to connect, but just cannot find the point of connection where there is capacity, right? So the country is really, in some part of the country, running out of power, so there's a bit of stress and anxiety around that. So, but the point is, at the same time, this country is saying, well, we want to be the world dominant AI country. So there is a need to bring the regulator, in the case of the US, bring the White House, bring the Google of the world, bring the company like us, like yours, and like yours, to the conversation and really have an open conversation about where does the US want to be 10 years from now, because the infrastructure needs a massive investment to enable whatever the US right now has in mind. So we need to take that long-term perspective. We need to take a step back, in maybe not in every country, but in certain countries.
And there is dynamics on several levels here. One is sort of on the municipality level that wants to establish local jobs. Another one is on the country levels that wants to reap the benefits of AI. And not everyone is in the US versus China game, but still all countries want to establish data centers for their own benefit, and maybe for helping others with higher prices and whatever to store some of the other data also. So when you have an opportunity and have a non-very price-sensitive player, and you lack grid, there is obviously a opportunity to connect those two and to tell the player that if you want to operate a data center or build a data center in a certain location, you also need to pay for the grid connection. That's normally not a big problem, except that it takes a long time to build connections. So I think as a minimum, this could be an upside for getting the data center players to pay for connections, and maybe even to speed up the pace of interconnectors and building grids.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I was interested in your comment, Anthony, about the US, and you know, I guess what we know in the UK is that the fastest sources of energy to deploy are renewables. So if you want to build out quick power, then renewables are a good option. But then the sort of flexibility element is more difficult. And I've always heard that data centers really require very, very stable power loads. But I can see Sophie shaking her head. So good to hear back on that. And my question was going to be, in the UK, is there an opportunity to, maybe with Sophie's environmental standards element as well, is there an opportunity to kind of demonstrate the data centers can be quickly deployed and powered by renewables and can assist flexibility and at a high standard in a way that will convince or demonstrate to other countries, the opportunity to do that? Or do you think we're more at risk because of this kind of stability need that actually the rollout of coal combined with data centers is going to look like a better option? I mean, how does it feel in the industry when looking at that question?
If I may, there is another dimension on top of what you say, is also that I'm hearing is about regulation around data. From when I talk to US customers, what I hear about this is well, there's a certain part of the world we're hesitant to go because there's a risk around regulation on data. If we train our models in this country or that country, there could be an implication versus the US. The regulation, we feel a bit more comfortable with it, right? So that's also another dimension which is not directly linked to the power system itself, which will drive where they want to build.
I was just going to follow on, Steve, your positivity from earlier on in the discussion. We are seeing some fantastic projects kicking off that are powering data centers. So I think of the Crane Clean Energy project, which is using Unit 1 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Microsoft have invested significantly alongside Constellation in that project, which will come online in about 18 months or so. That was a nuclear power reactor which was retired in 2019 because it was sub-economic. If I look at other success stories, really, the Sines project in Portugal is another great example. Now, that will be 1.2 gigawatts in total, but it's coming in at the moment with a relatively small first stage. But that not only is using 100% renewable energy, but it's also using seawater cooling from the old coal power plant. So this idea of reusing coal power plant sites, which we're seeing in the small modular reactor deployment as well, but also for co-location with data centers, is really positive. I think there's something to be thought about as well in terms of co-location and system thinking with cooling water systems or water systems that are pumping water around anyway. So don't have a load of auxiliary load because you can't use someone else's. Use someone else's water that's been pumped around. Same applies to actually some of the direct air capture and other capture technologies where they need water moving around. So thinking in a more systematic way, I think, is something that we'll all be required to do as we move forward.
So two observations from me, if I may. So obviously 50% of our business is in the US. So Tanya, it may not be visible, but the same tensions between large industrial and data centers is there. So at the same time, the administration's firmly behind AI dominance. It's trying to reshore massive amounts of production back into the US. So our upstate New York business, we got somebody trying to build a big chip fabrication plant up there, which is obviously a major consumer of electricity, and now we've got data centers sniffing around. Now, we had spare capacity up there, and everyone likes it up there because it's hydro, so not only is it green, but it's cheap. But you are seeing that same contention there. But then the other thing that's probably been missed, the administration at federal level is very willing to basically move fast and break things. So we had an executive order that was issued to the FERC to say you need to come up with a new interconnection process for large loads, including data centers, and you've got a month. You've got a month to get your proposals out. Now, part of you steps back and says, wow, but there is a challenge to the UK and other things. I'm a member of that, not very well-known club, Regulators Anonymous, but there was a time back in the 90s when the UK used to do reform quickly, and I think the pace that this thing's moving, we're going to have to take a view that says, yes, it would be nice to be in a world where we have 3-month consultations and everyone gets listened to, and it takes us 12 months to come up with an answer. But when the US is saying to its regulatory authority, you've got 21 days to get a proposal out, and you've got to implement it within 6 months, maybe we should challenge ourselves a bit to say, well, you know, we're going to have to go a bit faster on some of this stuff and accept that not everyone's going to like that. And as I said, we do have that in our DNA, and we do have that muscle memory somewhere, and maybe times are such that we need to start moving at that pace on some of these issues. I can see that's provoked a response, which it was designed to. So, Sophie, you go first.
I was going to make a short flippant remark, which is, you know, China would see, you know, and raise the US if you look at the impact there of state-directed policy around electrification and generation and use of AI. You know, it's pretty impressive. It sets a pretty high bar.
And it's actually just provoked by Alan's comment as well, which I thought was interesting earlier. If you actually think, are data centers and big tech stuff pulling through investments and actually contributing and bringing cleaner energy forward, I would say you're seeing it in some places and not in others. So right now I think you see in onshore wind and solar, I think you see it really helping to pull things through. And you're actually seeing things like, I think it was Google in the Netherlands managed to get an extension on a offshore wind farm so that it could live beyond its commercial life, which is really helpful. But right now, PPAs in offshore wind, new offshore wind, are not pulling things through, just the nature of the high capex up front, the nature of the commitment people can give. So there's a kind of, they're helping in some areas, but it's not going to get a new nuclear built in UK or get a new offshore wind built in UK yet. But it is an interesting source of pull that we're seeing in renewables where government doesn't have to do anything.
Just to bring a different topic as well. And in the spirit of COP, right, and international negotiations and all this, I think there is the whole topic of power shoring, right? We said location, but mostly within the country. But there is a discussion of where can we put these big loads that actually make sense, and you start to export bits and bytes and not electrons that are much harder to do it. And the COP presidency put AI as one of the key topics in the action agenda. And I think there is something behind it to try to get some sort of understanding and alignment on certification, CO2 accounting for that, power shoring principles, and how to make sure that this is part of the solution, right? The data center can be part of the solution for the energy transition, and not just one more burden in the system.
And just to build on what you say, Ricardo, just to open up maybe a bit broader conversation, we've been talking about AI, but it's in general, we are moving towards a world where electricity will be a bigger part of the overall energy mix, and so we need to invest. And so here, that means that we need really to take a long-term view. Right, so whether it's about AI, whether it's about EV transition, whether about industrialization, etc., we need to take a step back, country by country, and have a conversation around where is the country going 10, 20 years from now. And so that piece is essential because it takes time to build a supply chain. It takes time to design a plan that is sound and efficient. So, and at the end of the day, more and more we hear about the fight that the power system becomes a topic around national security, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to behave appropriately.
I was just pick up the point on energy storage, and particularly energy storage proximate to data centers. So at the moment, our energy storage approach is get a load of ISO containers, each with their own bit of kit in them and a few lithium-ion batteries. We've done some work looking at how do you build much bigger storage in actually a very similar shape to a data center. So rack-mounted batteries, double-stacked, integrated water cooling systems, integrated HVAC, single power income and outgoer, and so forth. And I think there's something there where you have a data center next door to a building which looks identical, which has got the ability not only to provide the redundancy needed for the data center, but also to provide significant time shift or auxiliary services into the network. We can't, from my perspective, keep on doing that with ISO containers. The social license to have the country littered with ISO containers doesn't work. So that's something that we're really keen to try and progress.
I think, Sophie, that's the answer to your question around how you get better at integrating renewable power into to power but data centers. It's much easier, obviously, to do it with a steady base load. But we can get better at doing it with intermittent renewables. We need to get smarter at storage. We need to get smarter at integrating the systems. We need to get smarter at making those data centers as efficient as possible. And a highly digitized, efficient approach is eminently possible.
Maybe on this topic, I can add some examples. So notably in the US, we are working a lot with GAFAM in order really, to put together renewables and batteries, plus algorithm with IA, in order really to be able to optimize everything and to be sure that we optimize, the storage. And then you minimize, of course, the need of upstream generation and then the impact on the grid. So it's already done. And we are also working with some of them in order even to deliver 24/7. This is, for instance, for Google. It's very important for them. And so we are really working on them in order to be able to do that. And we are doing first PPAs on that.
Sphere, I was just going to come in on your point on strategic planning, because there's again something that we need to learn, that not everywhere or every part of the country needs a data center in the same way that there were certain locations across that are optimal for offshore wind, or same with hydrogen. And the danger for municipalities is they are trying to spur growth on, and they are looking at it from a job opportunity and economic growth opportunity. But not every position in a country will be that location, essentially. And we need to get better at talking between the silos. Otherwise, we're about to just repeat everything that we've seen on energy generation, essentially, with technologies trying to compete against one another in various markets, essentially. And that's the big danger here, that you look at this topic of AI in that silo. There are a range of trade-offs that we've seen happen elsewhere, whether that's on growth versus sustainability, that we're still having that debate around. It's the speed versus resilience point. To Anthony's point, this is also a defense security play, essentially. So it needs to be seen from all those dimensions. But there's also this bit on private investment versus public regulation, or also public state funding. And there is something quite exciting at a moment where many countries are struggling on who pays for this grid infrastructure upgrade. No one has invested as much as they have done now on energy infrastructure. But the danger is that then you are making that prioritization as an economy to say, actually, these are the sectors that we're going to back because that's our economic vision. And there are some countries that are brave and bold and can do that. But for other countries, they want everything to compete in a fair way. So there has to be some bold choices that need to be made now. But I think what hasn't happened is that there are a lot of industries that need to be brought into that conversation. And heavy industry is quite an exciting one, essentially, to be brought around the table. And we all have a role to do that, so that it's not just, once again, just those involved in the energy sector having to deal with the challenge at hand.
Energy security is sort of the prominent part in the energy trilemma at the moment, and a lot of the issues around data centers needs to be seen in that context. And it's so easy to think that a data center is a data center, and whatever there is, it should have the same priority. But when you look at what is strategically important for a country, obviously industry is. So is data, but not all types of data. And we should not treat all data centers with the same way, as some of them are strategically important for a country, for individuals. Others are more for pleasure or leisure or whatever. And we tend to think of data centers as data centers today, but they are not.
I'm just conscious we're coming to the end, so I'll ask if people have got any sort of concluding thoughts. The one thing I just wanted to introduce as well is this whole technology is moving so fast. So and I think what you're seeing is, you know, people innovating around the energy sector constraints. So to the point about battery storage, you know, NVIDIA are now working on battery storage on the individual racks in the data centers. So actually building it into NVIDIA have a standardized design. And then the other thing is, you know, there's some fascinating work going on in the US by EPRI, where, again, they're rethinking the problem. And instead of building gigawatt data centers, do you build 205 megawatt data centers, and do you just situate them at distribution substations where there's land, where there's capacity, and do you put the storage and create massive distributed loads? So the other thing I think you have to be careful of is you know, you think you know what's going to happen in the next few years, and then you see the latest papers. But I think that is largely driven by a bunch of very innovative companies who have a huge incentive to just move as fast as they can, who, as I said, will just innovate around the problem. You know, they came to us and said, this is what we want to do. We said, that's a bit difficult. So they said, well, tell us why, and we'll just work out a way to get what we want in a different way. So I think you should be very careful not to forward cast on what we're seeing at the moment. But Anthony, that looks like it's provoked a response.
Yeah. Just want to build on what you say. To give you an example, I agree with the fact that it's not one recipe. I mean, recently we sat down with the CEO of one of the big hyperscaler from the Silicon Valley, and his vision is to put online 1 gigawatt of compute power every week, 1 gigawatt a week, right? So for that, you need to be flexible, right? Here you're going to build 10 small, quote-unquote small 100 megawatt. Here you're going to build a 2 gigawatt. You need to be smart and adapt on the reality. That's a very important point.
And just to completely blow your brains before others, I mean, love him or loathe him, I think Elon Musk was tweeting yesterday to said he's just going to put all the data centers up in the sky, use solar, and then just beam the data down. So, you know, and, you know, when most people say that, you think, who knows? But, you know, when it's Elon Musk and given the amount of satellites he's put up, so there are other completely mind-blowing solutions that could come along. So this is a very, very fast-moving space. So who's got some final observations before we wrap up, if I haven't just completely blown the conversation by mentioning the EM word?
No, I mean, what I was thinking there when you were saying that, Steve, was locational pricing, but that's maybe the extreme of locational pricing. But anyway.
I think you're right about being really flexible and nimble and how you solve for solutions. And I think you can look at locating data centers within circular ecosystems. So, for example, if you look at standing up EV charging, taking in available power in the vicinity, you can put an edge data center in to be the off-taker until the point at which you've got sufficient demand for the EV charging. So I think you can look at these things in lots of different ways, and we need to be super creative and try some things and see what works, rather than trying to find a perfect model.
And I'll stop after that. Just to your point, I agree. Right, we've been maybe spending an hour talking about how data centers are the problem, but they can also be part of the solution, right? We need to design them in a way that they can also contribute to the grid, right, when we need them. That's a really important point.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, overall, it sort of feels like certainly the build-out element is happening faster, like the energy use. I thought it was really interesting, all the different examples of how we're accelerating the use of AI in the energy system. And I suppose I kind of am left with a bit of a question about, like, what can governments do to kind of help that, or to kind of facilitate the really impactful uses of AI that can really reduce our energy consumption and can have that impact, that positive impact in the system? Is it kind of just a case that, well, the companies that are using it are going to use less energy, so that's going to be profitable, so, you know, it will happen? Or is there more that we should actually be doing to kind of push the really positive use cases?
I mean, maybe to close, I think it's a great point. I would tentatively suggest government's role is to at least tell that narrative, because I think many of us do believe that, and so at least explaining that. But it does then come back to Tanya's point that, and we, you know, we had this conversation yesterday when we were thinking about, you know, net zero and how you tell the story. There is a lot of fear around AI, which is very well founded. And so we just need to be careful that there are a whole bunch of people who'd listen to us all talking about how optimistic we are and say, we don't feel optimistic at all, not because we don't buy the whole story of all these amazing things. So I think that is something government does need to grapple with, which is how do we create an overall positive or optimistic story, but doesn't just get fixated on energy and what's the implications for energy, but actually talks holistically to people about what it might mean for their lives. And I don't underestimate how difficult that is to do, and we need to lean in and help you, but I do think there's a story to be told there. So at that point, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of you. Really appreciate you joining us, and for, I think, hopefully the audience found a stimulating and interesting conversation. So thank you all.